while Panamanians were getting ready for the Christmas holidays, the United States was secretly mobilizing 26,000 troops for a midnight attack.
I saw helicopters approaching. They were close. The lights went out and the helicopters began to shoot.
People were running left and right without direction, without knowing where they were going. It wasn't just machine gun fire. They were bombs. The noise was frightening.
You could hear gunfire coming from all directions, and a strange noise that we had never heard before. People were frightened, running, wondering what was going on. The sky was completely red, and there was a tremor you could feel throughout the city.
The invasion was swift, intense, and merciless. When it was over, thousands lay dead and wounded, and the country was in shambles. Millions of U.S. tax dollars were swallowed up in 3 days of brutal violence. The strategy was considered a stunning military and political success.
The operation continues.
In many ways, the invasion served as a testing ground for the Persian Gulf War 1 year later. It is also an indication of the kinds of intervention the United States may undertake in the years to come. But still, big questions remain. What exactly happened during the invasion of Panama, and why?
This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rattle reporting. Good evening. More than 20,000 U.S. soldiers and Marines launched their attack in the early morning darkness, backed by swarms of helicopters.
As the invasion unfolded, Americans stayed glued to their TVs and newspapers for coverage. But how much of the real picture did the media give them?
The performance of the mainstream news media in the coverage of Panama has been just about total collaboration with the administration. Not a critical murmur, not a critical perspective, not a second thought.
The story that the White House was pushing was getting this so-called narco-terrorist in a net. And that was the thrust of all of the coverage. When are we going to get Noriega? Have they let Noriega get away?
By late today, they had taken control of much of the country, but their chief target, General Manuel Noriega, escaped.
Manuel Noriega belongs to that special fraternity of international villains, men like Gaddafi, Idi Amin, and the Ayatollah Khomeini, whom Americans just love to hate.
The White House announced a $1 million reward for his capture.
And today, the Justice Department set up a hotline to take in tips on Noriega's possible whereabouts. That hotline number is...
They focused on Noriega to the exclusion of what was happening to the Panamanian people, to the exclusion of the bodies in the street, to the exclusion of the number dead, to the exclusion of what happened to the women and children in that country during this midnight invasion.
In some ways, the 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama was no surprise, given the history of relations between these two countries. The United States refused to recognize Panama's independence movement throughout the 1800s. But when the U.S. proposal to build a canal across the isthmus was turned down by Colombia, U.S. policy abruptly changed. In 1903, the United States provided military backup, enabling Panama to secede from Colombia. By doing so, the United States secured the rights to take over the canal project that had been abandoned by the French. In a treaty that was negotiated between the French canal investors and the United States, the Americans were granted sovereign control in perpetuity of a 10-mile-wide strip of land they called the Canal Zone. Panamanians were not included in the negotiations, and no Panamanian signed the treaty. The United States immediately placed the Canal Zone under military control.
Teddy Roosevelt was asked by what right he acquired possession of the canal. At least in the honest words of a thief, he said, "I took it." That gives you no right in law, never has. And hopefully never will.
The canal project had a dramatic impact on Panama. The U.S. imported cheap labor from the Caribbean, India, and Asia, changing the racial makeup of the country. Thousands of these workers died, and those who remained lived as part of a new racial underclass.
They created an apartheid system in Panama, a system that was based on racial segregation, where black people could not live in the same homes, where black people could not even use the same water fountain. The Jim Crow law that was practiced in the southern part of the United States was implemented in Panama by the United States government.
After the canal was completed in 1913, the United States continued to expand its military presence and tighten its grip on Panamanian politics. Violent confrontations between Panamanians and the U.S. military grew in the decades that followed. Tensions peaked in 1964 when students tried to exercise Panama's right to fly its flag in the Canal Zone. 21 Panamanians were killed and hundreds were wounded in the confrontation. In 1968, Panama's government was overthrown in a military coup. Omar Torrijos, a colonel in the National Guard, emerged as the new leader of Panama. Although he used repressive measures to consolidate his power, he became immensely popular. Torrijos introduced an unexpected period of social reform that benefited Panama's majority population of blacks, Indians, and mestizos.
It created what some people call a populist reformist process.
Humberto Brown, an administrator at the State University of New York, served as a Panamanian diplomat to the United Nations. He was educated in Panama during the Torrijos period.
Where for the first time in Panama you had a participation of the non-oligarchical people of the nation. Where people like myself get an opportunity to go to university, get a degree, where the peasants, where people from the mestizo, where all the people who were deprived an opportunity for once in our life were playing important roles in our nation.
In 1978, relations between the United States and Panama reached a high point. Jimmy Carter and Omar Torrijos negotiated treaties that abolished the 1903 treaty, establishing a new relationship between the two countries. The Carter-Torrijos treaties required the United States to vacate its military bases and withdraw its troops by the year 2000. Full control of the canal and the Canal Zone would be turned over to Panama. Although these new treaties were a source of pride for Panamanians, many conservatives in the United States had vehemently opposed them.
The Panama Canal Zone is sovereign United States territory, just as much as Alaska is, as well as the states carved from the Louisiana Purchase. We bought it, we paid for it, and General Torrijos should be told we're going to keep it.
In November 1980, Ronald Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter in a landslide election victory.
Ladies and gentlemen,
8 months later, on the night of July 31st, 1981, Omar Torrijos was killed in a fiery plane crash. The circumstances of the incident are unclear. Authorities said that his plane crashed into the side of a mountain, but witnesses said that the plane exploded in flight. Although his death was officially declared an accident, many suspect that he was assassinated. Some think that Manuel Noriega may have been involved, but many are convinced it was the CIA that was responsible.
I'm quite convinced that the CIA killed Torrijos, and this I know quite well because I work with Torrijos. And
Jose Chuchu Martinez was one of Torrijos' closest aides for many years.
They killed him precisely at the moment they had to kill him, at the moment that Torrijos was having a big influence over Central America, especially among the revolutionary movements. They killed Torrijos because Torrijos represented precisely the political solution of the whole Central American problem.
Waiting in the wings for his chance to take power was Colonel Manuel Noriega, the CIA's primary contact in Panama. Noriega was head of Panama's military intelligence and had a long-standing relationship with the United States. He had been on the CIA payroll since the 60s. When George Bush became director of the CIA in 1976, under President Ford, he inherited Noriega as a contact. Despite evidence that Noriega was involved in drug trafficking, Bush kept Noriega on the payroll. In fact, he increased Noriega's salary to more than $100,000 a year and eliminated a requirement that intelligence reports on Panama include information on drug trafficking.
Over the last 20 years, since Manuel Noriega was recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency to be an asset, he has obviously provided many, many important pieces of information to U.S. intelligence.
Peter Kornblue is senior analyst at the National Security Archive. The archive has assembled hundreds of previously classified government documents revealing the details of Noriega's relationship to U.S. intelligence.
They paid him an incredible amount of money, of American taxpayers' money, and obviously decided that his value to them was so important that his drug smuggling and other illegal activity could simply be ignored.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States, that I will support and defend...
After George Bush became vice president under Ronald Reagan in 1981, he was named head of the administration's anti-drug campaign and once again took responsibility for monitoring Noriega's intelligence activities.
Bush, in fact, seems to have been instrumental, even according to the documented evidence the administration itself has made available, in seeing to it that Noriega was well taken care of. And in fact, Admiral Stansfield Turner, the former director of the CIA under Carter, claims that he cut Noriega off, that he removed him from the U.S. payroll. Bush put him back on and, in fact, gave him a raise and developed an even closer relationship than had existed before.
With support from the CIA, Noriega was able to outmaneuver his rivals, and in August of 1983, he became commander of the Panamanian military. As the Reagan administration expanded its covert war against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, Noriega became increasingly helpful. Working with the CIA and with Israeli arms dealers, Noriega helped coordinate an arms supply network to provide weapons to Contra bases in northern Costa Rica.
It is by now undeniable that the same planes that were carrying arms from Panama into Costa Rica were also carrying drugs. And in fact, the people who were the pilots flying those arms to the Contras and flying drugs on up, eventually reaching the United States, have been indicted and are now serving time.
This operation essentially gave Manuel Noriega the assurance that they would turn a blind eye to his continued brokering of cocaine deals in return for using his network to get the arms to the Contras in northern Costa Rica.
Noriega's involvement in the drug traffic really increased his importance as a source for the CIA and as someone who was able to conduct dirty tricks in the region for the CIA. So it's no accident that the CIA became the most prominent defenders of Noriega against the drug charges, because that's the sort of thing which CIA clients tend to do. Time after time, when we install strongmen in the third world, because we want them to be strong, we want to see them involved with the strongest local economic forces, which time after time are the drug traffic.
Despite Noriega's collaboration with many U.S. covert operations, he was becoming increasingly uncooperative with U.S. objectives in Central America. In 1984, he angered the Reagan administration by hosting Latin American leaders at the Contadora peace talks. The talks called for an end to U.S. intervention in Central American affairs.
Noriega was not the yes man that the United States wanted him to be. He simply didn't like to be pushed around. He certainly didn't like people like John Poindexter or even William Casey coming down to his villa and telling him what he should do or what he shouldn't do.
Then in 1986, the Iran-Contra scandal erupted. Noriega's primary contacts in the administration were now under intense scrutiny.
Oliver North was fired, Poindexter was forced to resign, and William Casey fell ill with a brain tumor. So all three of Noriega's major protectors were out of government, and that led quickly to a shift in U.S. policy.
Sentiments within Panama were turning against Noriega as well. For 3 years, Noriega worked with the DEA in a sting operation codenamed Operation Pisces. In 1987, with Noriega's assistance, authorities arrested hundreds of suspects and froze millions of dollars in Panama's banks, severely disrupting the money laundering business. The financial community was outraged, and Noriega's opponents mobilized against him. Back in Washington, Noriega's opponents lobbied and testified against him, accusing him of murder, corruption, and drug running. The U.S. media quickly turned it into a major story.
United States, but relations with Panama are under a new cloud tonight because of news reports
Senator
alleging...
Jesse Helms charged today that the military strongman of Panama, Manuel Noriega, is the #1 drug trafficker in the Americas. Helms said, depending on how the situation with
the reports
Noriega
from U.S. intelligence have also led to new investigations on Capitol Hill.
Faced with increased pressure, both in the U.S. and Panama, Noriega introduced a wave of brutal repression, attacking protesters in the streets and jailing hundreds of opponents. The Reagan administration now openly called for his removal.
We do want Noriega out of there and a return to a civilian democratic government.
But behind the scenes, the administration was secretly negotiating with Noriega, promising not to indict him on drug charges if he would cooperate with U.S. objectives in Central America. Gabrielle Gemma, director of the Independent Commission of Inquiry on the U.S. invasion of Panama, spoke to Noriega about his negotiations with the U.S.
General Noriega told us that there were a number of demands placed on him directly, both through Poindexter and other meetings, where the State Department pressured him to change the Panamanian government's policy on several issues. He said that by far the most pressing was a demand by the United States that Noriega and the Panamanian government allow the U.S. to expand their military presence in Panama and to renegotiate the treaties to allow them to keep control over the 14 bases, military bases, that presently exist in Panama.
Noriega refused to agree to the U.S. demands or to relinquish his power in Panama. In February 1988, 2 U.S. federal grand juries in Florida indicted Noriega, accusing him of drug trafficking, money laundering, and racketeering. It was the first time a foreign head of state had ever been indicted in the United States. The U.S. now undertook a systematic effort to overthrow Noriega. Economic sanctions were stepped up and additional troops were dispatched to Panama.
The United States tonight declared in effect that Panama's General Manuel Noriega is a threat to this country's national security.
Mr. Noriega, the drug-related, indicted dictator of Panama. We want to bring him to justice, we want to get him out, and we want to restore democracy to Panama. And so when you read these outrageous charges by a drug-related, indicted dictator, discount them. They are total lies.
Still unable to force Noriega from power, the United States turned its efforts to influencing the upcoming 1989 Panamanian national elections. The Bush administration, working through the CIA and the National Endowment for Democracy, funneled more than $10 million into the opposition's slate of candidates. Presidential candidate Guillermo Endara, a wealthy corporate lawyer educated in the United States, and his vice presidential running mates, Guillermo Billy Ford and Ricardo Arias Calderon.
If the same scenario that those elections occurred and had taken place in the United States, they would have been illegal. In the United States, accepting money from a foreign government for the purpose of influencing a domestic election is illegal.
Those elections were irregular from the beginning. How can you call it a fair election? The strategy was applied in Panama, they applied in Nicaragua, and they were applied to every government who disagreed with the U.S. foreign policy. They used economical sanction to starve people, then to impose a vote on these people, because people vote to get bread when they're hungry. And I don't think that's democracy.
The elections were held, the counting of the votes began, it became clear that the PRD would lose the election. And at that point, and not for the first time in the history of Panama or many other countries in Central America, the military rulers halted the electoral process.
The country erupted in violence as ballot boxes were seized. The U.S.-supported candidates who had been leading in vote tallies were brutally beaten on the streets of Panama City in front of rolling TV cameras. The assailants were alleged to be Noriega's Dignity battalions, although none were ever identified. It was a photo opportunity that crystallized world public opinion against Noriega.
Good evening. The violence in Panama escalated sharply this evening when government goons attacked candidates opposed to General Manuel Noriega.
Were attacked and beaten up on the streets of Panama City. Guillermo Endara,
and one of the opposition presidential candidate, was beaten and injured during the day by backers of military strongmen.
Later, the presidential candidate Endara was released from the hospital. It has been confirmed that he was attacked by goons.
The following day, President Bush ordered 2,000 additional troops into Panama.
I will do what is necessary to protect the lives of American citizens, and we will not be intimidated by the bullying tactics, brutal though they may be, of the dictator Noriega.
After the election fiasco, the Panamanian National Assembly declared a state of emergency and appointed Noriega head of state. George Bush now openly encouraged the Panamanian military to revolt against Noriega.
But we'd love to see him get him out. We'd like to see him out of there.
With support and encouragement from the United States, a group of officers from the Panamanian Defense Forces, the PDF, began planning a military coup to overthrow Noriega. They secretly met several times with the U.S. Southern Command to coordinate support for the overthrow.
The role to be played by the United States Army was to block certain roads, make sure that certain airfields were not made available for use by elements loyal to or potentially loyal to General Noriega.
With these assurances, the insurgent troops launched the coup attempt. They quickly overpowered Noriega's guards, seized the PDF headquarters, and captured Noriega. But the Americans did not carry through on their promises. Forces loyal to Noriega were allowed to gain entrance and crush the rebellion, freeing General Noriega. President Bush later denied any U.S. involvement in the operation.
This was some American operation, and I can tell you that is not true. But I would repeat, in the hopes that it be conveyed instantly to Panama, we have no argument with the Panamanian Defense Forces. We have no argument with them. We've had good relations with the Panamanian Defense Forces.
But investigative journalist Doug Vaughn, who was in Panama during the failed coup attempt, disputes Bush's claims.
That the idea, at least on the American side, was to lead these coup plotters along, to seduce them into believing that they had the support of the United States, and then at a critical moment abandon them, so that then the excuse could be made that we had to smash the PDF completely, that we couldn't rely anymore on disgruntled officers inside the Panamanian army to rise up against Noriega, and we would have to do this job ourselves.
After the October coup attempt, 1,300 additional U.S. troops were flown into Panama, and offensive military equipment was secretly deployed. The U.S. military stepped up its campaign of intimidation and provocation, setting up roadblocks, confronting PDF forces, and conducting offensive military maneuvers outside of U.S. jurisdiction.
They have blocked passage here, calling it a security problem. What security? The Panamanian people would never threaten them. They are the ones threatening. They are the ones who charge at us with their weapons. What's wrong with them?
They charge the bayonets at us. They charge us with their bayonets in order to scare us. They said not to step onto that area, but they're on our side. It's Panama's jurisdiction. So what the hell's with them?
It came to an inch that day the killing didn't start, because the tanks and everything were ready to go in to kill the Panamanian people.
In the final months before the invasion, the Army Special Operations Command sent a highly secret Delta Force team to Panama.
There were numerous actions undertaken by that Delta team which were reported in the United States press as provocations undertaken by Panamanians against the United States, infiltrations of United States positions, shots fired in the direction of United States perimeters and positions, roughing up of United States citizens in the streets.
Sabina Virgo, a national labor organizer, was in Panama just weeks before the invasion.
Provocations against the Panamanian people by United States military troops were very frequent in Panama, and they had several results, and in my opinion, probably a couple of different intents. One, I think, was to create an international incident, was to have United States troops just hassle the Panamanian people until an incident resulted. And from that incident, the United States could then say that they were going into Panama for the protection of American life, which is in fact exactly what happened.
On the night of December 16th, a group of U.S. Marines ran a military roadblock in front of PDF headquarters and were fired on by Panamanian guards. Lieutenant Robert Bolivar Paz, a U.S. Marine intelligence officer, was killed. The Marines were reported to be part of a group called the Hard Chargers, known for provoking confrontations with PDF forces. The Pentagon claimed the Marines were unarmed and lost, but local witnesses said that they were armed and exchanged fire with the PDF headquarters, wounding a soldier and 2 civilians.
An American serviceman has been killed in a weekend shooting incident.
What U.S. officials called an example of General Noriega's cruelty and brutality.
Shooting death of an American officer, which President Bush condemned today as an outrage.
And that in another incident, a Navy officer and his wife were detained. He beaten and threatened with death. She threatened sexually.
Another American serviceman also threatening that man's wife. Strong public support for a reprisal was all but guaranteed.
4 days later, on December 20th, U.S. troops invaded Panama. The invasion was codenamed Operation Just Cause. Shortly after midnight, U.S. troops simultaneously attacked 27 targets, many of which were in densely populated areas. One of the primary targets in Panama City was the headquarters of the Panamanian Defense Forces, located in the crowded neighborhood of El Chorrillo. U.S. troops shelled the area for 4 hours before moving in and calling for surrender.
We ask you to surrender. If you do not, we are prepared to level each and every building. Surrender now.
About 10 minutes after they've been speaking this surrender, surrender, we start to hear the helicopters start to bomb the cuartel and start to use their laser ray and things like that. So we hit the ground.
It soon became clear that the objectives were not limited only to military targets. According to witnesses, many of the surrounding residential neighborhoods were deliberately attacked and destroyed.
The helicopters were heavily armed, firing powerful machine guns and rockets, and they were firing indiscriminately. They weren't just looking for military targets. They were firing at many civilians. People were running all over, trying to escape.
They shot at everything that moved, without mercy and without thinking whether they were children or women or people fighting. Instead, everything that moved, they shot.
We all thought that they would just take Noriega. They said that's what they wanted. They would take him and would respect everyone else.
After the bombing been going on for a few hours, the soldiers say, tell everybody to come out with their hand on their head, and they direct us to the church. When we were in the church about 6 o'clock in the morning, all of a sudden, the building started to burn in front of the church. The people, as they know the only thing they have was inside the place, they tried to run out to get water to halt it. And the American soldiers tell them to get out. Some people, stubborn, they try to go in, and the American soldiers, he shot it up in the air. And the people that get scared, and they run back.
We saw that the North Americans were denying people access to their homes. They sent people back and threatened them with their machine guns and forbid anyone to get close to the houses or walk in or around the alleys leading to the houses. Then they began to set the houses on fire.
The Panamanian soldiers then know each alley, how to go in and how to come out and where to go and come through, from one street to another street climb up and go to a balcony and things. So the only way I think the American soldiers could get rid of that danger was to burn down the building there. That way the Panamanian soldier couldn't have nowhere to hide.
I'm unaware of any operations by U.S. military to go through and systematically burn down buildings. You get fires that are started by weapons, but I haven't seen any reports of U.S. military folks going through and setting buildings on fire.
The North Americans began burning down El Chorrillo at about 6:30 in the morning. They would throw a small device into a house and it would catch on fire. They would burn a house and then move to another.